everyone. Welcome to this special episode from the Yon-Say Podcast Network. As part of Tadaima 2023, we're going to be recording this special one-off live episode titled Our Ancestors' Wildest Dreams, where we'll talk about our thoughts and feelings being young adults and activists in the Japanese American community. And we want to go over some of our hopes and experiences in this space, as well as share advice for others and answer some questions from you, the audience. As this is a live podcast recording, please bear with us if we need a moment to stop, pause, and think about the conversation, because it'll come across differently over video versus the audio format that we'll post later on. But without further ado, let us kick off this special episode with some introductions, and I'll start first. So again, hello everyone, my name is Matthew Wisely. I use he, him pronouns. I am a member of Nikkei Rising, the young adult branch of JA Memorial Pilgrimages, and I work on the Yon-Say podcast, and I will be one of your co-hosts for today. You might also know me from my day job as Education Programs Manager for JCL National. And with that, I will pass it to my other co-host, Lauren.
Hi everyone, I'm Lauren Matsumoto. I use the gender pronoun she, hers. I also am part of Nikkei Rising as a coordinator for all things JA, as well as Yon-Say podcast, which will be, rebranding soon as Nikkei Rising podcast. I'm based in Southern California. I'm a fourth generation Japanese American Yon-Say and a third, fourth generation Chinese American. I will now pass it off to one of our guests, Casey. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Lauren, and thanks so much for having me. Hi, everyone. My name is Casey Mukai. I use she, her pronouns. I currently reside in the Bay Area on unceded Ohlone land. I'm Yon-Say on my father's side and second generation Chinese American on my mother's side, with family who is incarcerated at Gila River in Poston. And because of that history, I am deeply committed to standing up for injustice today and also serving my community. And I do this primarily through Tsuru for Solidarity, the Young Buddhist Editorial, Japanese American Youth Alliance, as well as Berkeley Buddhist Temple, and previously JACL. In my day job, I'm an assistant director of parent and family philanthropy, where I help parent donors make meaningful gifts. And I'm also honored to be serving as the 2023 Northern California Cherry Blossom Festival Queen. Thanks for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
Haruka, would you like to also introduce yourself?
Yes, sure. Thank you so much, Laura and Matt, for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm Haruka Kokaze. I'm currently a student at NYU studying counseling for mental health and wellness. And a lot of my work at school and outside of school focus on Japanese Americans' mental health. I was born in Hyogo Prefecture, and I grew up in Tokyo, New York, Houston, and London because of my parents' jobs. So I consider myself as a child of Japanese expat, and I am definitely trying to figure out what the term that look like in the future. But I am very passionate about finding the culturally inclusive assessment tools for Japanese Americans, whether that is Japanese expats families, Japanese Americans, Shinusei or Shinusei. So I'm really excited to be part of this conversation today.
Yeah, and we're really excited to have both of them here as guests. Maybe we're biased because they're friends of ours, but they have a lot to share with us today. So let's get started with some of the questions that we've already predetermined. So to set the stage for this conversation, what are some generational differences that you notice within the Japanese American community? I kind of leave it broad when I say generational difference. That could be up to you to determine whether you mean immigration generation, Sansei versus Yon-Say, or age generation, such as boomers versus millennial/Gen Z. So let's have Casey start off.
Yeah, thanks so much for this question. So when I hear about generational differences, I think primarily through the scope of our community's relationship to incarceration, and then also our relationship to community work and how our different generations go about that. And so in reference to Professor Donna K. Nagata's work on Sanseis, Yonseis, and subsequent generations. Our generations view the incarceration experience quite differently and have like different relationships to it. And I think from what I noticed and from what she studied, we Yon-Say and later on generations have more of a call to social justice, for advocating on behalf of our communities and on behalf of other communities facing injustice today. And then also, I think generational differences show up in the way that we, come to think about our community and get involved. I grew up, primarily in a Buddhist community, Jodo Shinshu Buddhist in the Central Valley. And through that experience, I was able to see a lot of the ways that, the older generations came back and supported the community through the ways that they would take up board positions and the ways that, the obachans would bring food to service and things like that. And so in the way I saw really how this community is loved. But I also saw a tendency perhaps for, older generations to want to hold on to those positions of power or want to, carry on more traditional mindsets of how we run our, community organizations. And so I think in that sense, it's, come up to me in a sense of what I've come to be known as founder syndrome. Um, However, with that, I think, there also is the hope that, older generations have so much hope for younger generations in the sense that they always want to see us thrive and they always want us to be in these leadership positions, which is so encouraging to see. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks for sharing that, Casey. I think that's very true. And so I think hopefully with this conversation, we'll delve a little bit more on how we can have a better dialogue on addressing some of these differences that we notice. Haruka, do you have anything to add, a different perspective, seeing that you grew up in a different community, in a different environment?
Yeah, I think it was really interesting to hear Casey's points because some of the things I really resonate with, even as a person in the Japanese expat communities. And I think just to give a little further context to my upbringing, I had, about 10 years in America and 10 years in Japan. So I'm pretty much, bicultural, binational. But I am still Japanese citizens, but, I had my elementary through college education here in America. And so I think my perspective really comes from living in that Japanese expats community, which is very small, very much isolated from the bigger JA Japanese communities. So my kind of take is that, and also kind of comparing the difference between my generation, which is kind of Gen Z millennial, and my parents, like a boomer, or that kind of era. But yeah, I think just like Casey was talking about in the JA communities, I think our generation is more engaged or more aware of the social issues. And when I talk about social issues, I'm specifically kind of referring to racism and anti-Asian hate crimes because that is something that I feel very passionate in terms of doing the research for Asian Americans' mental health in terms of how racial encounters impact that. And I personally did, experience racism for the first time when I came to America and growing up in New York and Texas. And it's so fascinating for me to see how Japanese expat communities react to those racism incidents and also kind of the anti-Asian hate crime that happened COVID-19 because I felt like the JA community really came together even with the bigger Asian communities as a whole to kind of stand up together for ourselves. But I didn't see that much interaction within the Japanese expats communities. And again, this is just from my personal communities, but what I saw was that there was a lot of indifference in terms of this kind of social issues. And I think it comes kind of the fact that, yes, they do come to America, they live for a little bit, but they do come here knowing that they have to leave in 3 years. So they kind of come here, let's do the task, let's build a business, and we'll be back in Japan to further the business there. So why would they waste their energy and time onto social issue that is not gonna affect them long term? And it was very sad for me to see that because, yes, our parents, the boomer generation, the one working for the Japanese companies, and they have Japanese colleagues, they have, nomikai, nijikai, that kind of thing that they can have fun. But on the other hand, their children, like myself, were in American public schools, and we were often the only Japanese students, and all these racism or even microaggression we experienced, we never had that place to talk about it, to process it with their parents, because they wouldn't be able to get what you're talking about. And I think one example personally is for me to experience, microaggression at my college, and I really didn't know where to go, because when I talked about that with my parents or in a Japanese expats community, they just didn't get it. They just didn't get the nuance. And I think I was so fortunate to have like JA mentors who knew what it means to be Japanese American America, and what it means to experience those and have that kind of space to process that. But I think that's a main issue, or the difference that is kind of dividing us in terms of how we approach that issue. And I think it's kind of intersection between the older generation, younger generation, but it's the acculturation, immigration level too, because we are more integrated into the bigger American culture, um, versus our parents and expat communities who are very much living in that bubble, and they don't really like to go outside, which I find it really interesting. At the same time, I understand it. It's very comforting, and it's safer to feel in a community where you can kind of share like a mini culture within the Japanese Americans.
Yeah, thanks so much, Haruka, for bringing that the expat experience and also your background in mental health to the conversation, because I think that's so important, especially when speaking on topics around anti-Asian hate and our feelings of safety, and also the topics you're bringing up about cultural values and how they become more socialized once you're here in America for a longer time. You come to understand social issues a lot more. I think similarly, I feel like I see this trend happen that did happen, with the Sansei, the Nisei generation as well. And I think, it's continuing throughout, our generations too. Um, Sorry, what was my point here? Oh, so yeah, and I completely agree with like our younger generations, we hold more progressive and more radical views, and that's very, very important for, quote unquote pushing the needle. And it can be very helpful, to have those, strong allies as well, which brings me to my point of like, even though we do see these generational differences, I don't think it's much less of I think, a divide, but more of like a maybe separation in the fact that like I still see like older generation people who are very, very radical, maybe even more radical than me, right? And then there's also people our age that are very conservative in their values as well. And so being able to like have conversations with folks that think differently is, I think, very important. Um, it reminds me of a recent experience. So I'm part of Tutor for Solidarity, and we went on a retreat recently. And part of this retreat, we were honored to have kind of a intergenerational conversation about abolition, which was, very, very, very interesting, because I recognize you can't hold that conversation in a lot of spaces, right? That's a very hard topic to handle. And even for the elders that were on a retreat, it was almost hard for them as well, because we all have different ideas of what does community safety look like, right? What do we see as, the future of like, what does being an ally to the Black community look like? What does being, a diverse community look like? And so I think, being able to have true empathy and understanding for, our elders, and like come to understand like where they're coming from, but also being able to advocate for, more progressive ideas, I think is very important.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what both of you said really resonates with me, especially, and I know Lauren and a lot of us in Nikkei Rising. This is an ongoing conversation that a lot of us have had, and actually, that was really the impetus for this podcast recording, and why we decided to host this live recording was because we realized we haven't really done an episode on this kind of topic. What us as younger generations really want the older generations or different generations to know about from our perspective, but also opening up that dialogue, like you said, and making it more about working together and talking to one another, as opposed to just, this is how we want things to go versus this is how you want things to go. And so we really are glad that we're able to have this space and have everyone here to talk about this. And also hopefully get some comments and questions from folks online as well. And also hopefully this won't be the end of it. We want this to keep being an ongoing conversation between younger and older generations, different generations of Japanese Americans. And I think it's a really good start to that. But with that, I think we got into it a little bit, but I want to hear some more about this, moving on to our next topic, sort of. As advocates, as people in this space, what advice would you give those of a different generation when working with yourself, communicating with yourselves and people of our generations, whether it's, again, Yon-Say, Go-Say, Nikkei, or any of those different labels that we like to throw around? And whoever wants to start first.
If I may add just quickly to, your point, Matt and Casey, on the, providing a platform and kind of talk about this in this kind of community is so important. And I always think about the uses of language. Casey kind of pointed out that I don't see this as a division, but more like a separation. And I think I'm always trying to be aware of what kind of language I use, because that is a tool we use to communicate. And yes, we do have different knowledge and awareness for a lot of things, but at the same time, our language, not just level of English or Japanese kind of thing, but it's kind of what kind of vocabs we use in terms of expressing ourselves. And I think about how the older generation never had the opportunity to learn how to express and identify how they feel. And I think this is not just for the expat communities, but I think at the JCA conference, we, all talked about how it's like a gaman and grit and all this kind of cultural norms where, we don't bring the issues outside our family and that kind of things. And I even think about, back in Japan when I first learned English, our textbook had, "How are you? I'm good. Thank you. What about you?" And there was not even an option to say, "Oh, I'm not doing good," or, "Oh, I'm tired." And I think that the tiny, tiny difference in how we express those, language and expression is so important. So I just wanted to say that I really resonated and really, respect that you kind of choose that word to describe where you are, Casey. But in terms of this question, kind of connecting back to that, I think the mindfulness in terms of the usage of language is very important when we talk about things, and not make the assumption just because they use different terms or different expression, and kind of understand that they are coming from different contexts. And I think when I think about the difference in generation, I think about the older generations versus my generation. Maybe that's because I'm still a student and haven't had the opportunity to interact with people younger than me. And I'm still exploring that, and I hope to explore a little bit more. But something I learned from the usage language and think about ourselves is identities. And we talk a lot about identities. And something I noticed that is so powerful within the expats communities, kids, and also the young JA community is that we feel more confident when we're, being true to ourselves. And I feel like a lot of again, in the expats communities, a lot of the older generations don't like it when we're different from other people. And I see that, message through even my father, who has been working for the same company for 35 years. And, I still see him to this day working until 1 and 2 a.m. And I thought, okay, I get that that's a salaryman's kind of schedule, but like, why are you doing that? And he was like, well, well, my supervisor, my subordinates, and my colleagues are doing this, so I have to do it. And so I felt like it's the idea of conformity, and we have to be exactly the same. We have to fit into the mold. But I think for what I see in our generation is that we value those differences and respect those differences. And so something I really love to see my parent generation to be okay with us being different and respect the fact that we are coming from a different, backgrounds and different beliefs, and not put us into the mold and kind of, make a comment or criticize us for being too different, because I think being different is very cool.
Yeah, just want to jump in to say I completely agree with all of that. I think, our community has this tendency just to maybe stay with tradition a little more than we should, rather than like recognize that we're constantly evolving, our community is constantly evolving, what it looks like, how it's made up of, and how we, come to be together. And I think, part of that is understanding that the intergenerational component of our community that's so important. It goes both ways, and those conversations and dialogue needs to go both ways. So in the same way that, our elders are always passing down knowledge to us, like they have a lot of knowledge to gain and wisdom to gain from what we have to bring to the table. And I think, I can sometimes feel just a little jaded, for lack of a better term, when communicating with elders, or when trying to do, maybe youth programming that's a little bit out there, or we, come out with a stance on something political that's maybe, not as widely recognized. And it can feel definitely daunting to, have disagreement or have differing views or push against, that mold, as you were saying, a little bit more. But I think that, it's great when you are able to get, what you want across, and what you are able to get across, and like the relationships you're able to build.
Yeah, I think I love that. It's the communication happens or the passing knowledge happens bi-directional, and it's not just the older generation passing the wisdom, because that's kind of like the stereotype or kind of expectations that a lot of people have. And I think that thanks to people like Matt and Lauren, I was able to learn a lot about what's been happening in Japanese American communities. I think, as a lot of people know, in Japan, we don't really learn about Japanese American history. So for me, it was new to learn about that in the last couple of years. And for me, I've learned that these Japanese Americans, really worked so hard to integrate our community into the bigger society. And that's something I respect so much. And I think about how it is so important to respect that. And at the same time, for us to kind of utilize maybe, reverse mentoring or sort of, and kind of have that, like, hey, we also learn so much from you, but at the same time we can also provide all of the things. And for me, a great leaders that I met in JA communities are someone who say, I don't know, or someone who say, I need help, or can you tell me more about that, instead of them pretending that they know. And especially when it comes to social issues like mental health, like obviously our generation had more opportunity to be exposed to the conversation, have the high level of, the vocabulary to talk about those things. And I think I feel really passionate about, educating, or, sharing that knowledge and learning together with, my parents' generation people, or even older. And I think that, I love when people kind of, just like Casey, see our conversation on bi-directional, instead of just us like observing all these knowledge and it's like, now what? And so, yeah, I really appreciate your comments.
Yeah, and I think on both sides of just like giving grace of like it just takes time to understand where each other is coming from. And I think what I also mean by grace is something that Haruka mentioned was, language. I think we are, as a younger generation, is privileged in being growing up in a very unique environment of where we are able to more freely explore different aspects of our identity in a little bit more safer way. I mean, it could be argued that it's more contentious, but what I mean by that, not just only our ethnicity, but sexuality, gender, things like that. And so I know a common conversation or thing to be said is just frustration, because they're like, oh, there's so many different terms coming around being thrown. And while I understand that frustration, I think to understand that we haven't fully figured it out ourselves as well. The reason why there's so many terms being thrown out is we haven't had that opportunity and space to explore that. And we, in a sense, feel a little bit more safer, more secure, more confident, right? As Haruka mentioned, we're more confident in what we're feeling. We have more confidence in wanting to be different. We accept that more readily than folks back then. And understanding probably they couldn't as freely because they were going through wars or they were going through different other crises. So I definitely would say giving grace into that, but I think too at a certain extent, um, maybe this should just be my personality wise, but at a certain extent too, there's only so much grace that I will give. I think after a while, right, of having that conversation or dialogue, I will be firm, and this is, respect people's gender pronouns or respects people's views, because I'm not going to be pushed over. The world is changing, and it's going to continue to change. And the way I want the world to change is to be a more inclusive and safe and understanding world. And that means being more open to the different topics, dialogues that we're having. So that was just something that came to my mind about conversation. I think one that's more specific to the Japanese community that we can talk about too. Matt and I have this conversation a lot. It's also part of the work he does is even just terminology of what we talk about. 3 out of 4 of us here have Japanese American incarceration family history. The terminology that's being used, I remember growing up, my grandpa till the day he died, the terminology that he used and knew was internment. But we since then recognized that internment, relocation center, those words are actually euphemisms, and that there are better terminologies to better define what that experience is like. And so it took me a really, really long time when I first learned in college, oh, I shouldn't be saying internment, I should be saying incarceration or concentration camps. So I understand. That's why I give grace to those that, when I hear people using internment, I'm always kind of like, hey, like terminology has since changed. This is what it is. And understanding that it might take you a couple conversations until you get the hang of it. That's totally understandable. You knew this term for a really long time. But if you are actively refusing to want to change, then that's not in a point to sometimes, we also have that conversation of for your own mental health, sometimes you don't want to engage actively in that conversation. So yeah. I guess moving on, so we talked a lot of about what advice we have for older generation folks, because we want to be heard. This is our time to be heard. But now kind of shifting it on to kind of our generation, what advice do you have for folks our age on, having a discussion with someone? I guess I like the terminology that Casey mentioned, like separation. How do we have a conversation with folks where we notice that there's a separation, whether in views, maybe because of generational reasons or whatnot? So I'll have Casey first talk about it since she coined the term separation in our conversation today.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. Yeah, so I think that, and I think I touched on this earlier too about how, uh, in thank you for so beautifully and eloquently putting, Lauren, your term about like practicing empathy in these conversations and understanding, because I think the perhaps like the like radical in me is so like quick to be like, okay, like let's burn down the system and da, 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 right, but like I definitely like understand as well, and I honor like that our elders and our community are the reason that our community exists today, and the wisdom that they have, and that the real work that they put in to make sure that our community survived out of the camps, and survived out of redevelopment, and structural racism is very important. And so I think it's important to honor that history and recognize that. But then I think and for our generation, it's important to just value ourselves as, in our opinions as the younger generation. And even though it is really daunting sometimes to have that courage to stand up to our elders, um, I think what's also important to hold as a younger generation is uh, that find those allies that are older than you. I think, in a community as intertwined as ours and as complicated as ours, I feel like there's a lot of like hierarchical structures and familiar structures that you have to work through, especially in the nonprofit and the Japantown spaces. And so I think that it's important for, younger generations to find mentors that are older than you, find people that are willing to advocate because while there's always like this um like saying that, we'll give, younger folks this position, like a youth position, and give them voting power and a seat at the table. But then that doesn't always do a lot because then those ideas aren't supported or, those ideas aren't funded or advocated for. So I think just to say like, practice that balance of being able to push and advocate for yourself when needed.
Yeah, thank you, Casey, again for kind of educating me further on what's happening in a J community, especially in a Japantown, because again, like that's something that I don't really have exposure to, and I'm so thankful that past conference at JCL in LA was one of the first opportunity for me to really witness the West Coast Japanese American communities. But something also resonate as a fellow social activist in our Japanese American community is that I see my peers kind of like losing hope or losing that um, power to continue going because social activist exhaustion is so real, and there's so much stuff that we do as upcoming next generation leaders, but there's also at the same time so much we can do. And I personally experienced that exhaustion, recently with like, oh, like I'm doing so much work around this. Why am I not getting so much support from the older generation or the community as a whole? And I think it's really interesting for me to like kind of evaluate what's happening for my peers because I'm also kind of part of that community. But something I've noticed recently is that we are kind of losing that curiosity we used to have when we started. And I think that might be because, again, like losing hope or not having the successful stories enough, or maybe our media is highlighting such negative incident that is happening in our community, and it's kind of like, okay, so what is our work doing? And I think I love sharing this with my, I guess, my generation of people is that we're we're not going to change the system. That's just not going to happen in the next 10 to 20 years. But we are bridging that path. We are creating that opportunity for even our next generations that we haven't even had a chance to talk to. And so we are indeed doing that important work, but maybe the outcome is not going to be, up so right. So I think having this kind of mindset allowed me to, and also my fellow social activists, to have more realistic conversation with the older generation because I have this joke with my friends how our favorite exercise is jumping into conclusions. So it's kind of like making assumption every single time and making all these conclusions without even providing that platform to get to know them better and just assume just because they're a different generation they just don't get it. But I try make sure that I take time and make sure I understand their side first and kind of think about a lot of things in a macro lens, and then at the end of the day know that the work that I do every day is indeed making a difference, but maybe it's just not going to be something I see in my lifetime, which is okay, because I know that we are making that path for the next people. And that's what our, Oji-chan Oba-chan did for us. So it's kind of like exact same pattern continuing.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much, Monica, for like pointing out that kind of bittersweet sentiment of, the change that we are so looking towards and working for isn't always going to be successful, especially, seeing those, necessary results, but it's that kind of like being able to visualize that and want that for the next generation. And I think like I realize like even though I'm only 24, like I'm getting old. Like, soon I can no longer identify with, or not soon, but like with the youth, the quote unquote young JA term. And I start to realize that more, especially as like I'm um, after I graduated, I started helping out and interacting more with some of like the Nikkei student unions in my area, and seeing the way that the college and collegiate level Nikkei are forming community, the way that they're expressing themselves, and it just gives me so much hope. And so I would say also to go back to the question of like to my generation that's like going to be getting older and a newer generation is coming in, I say like have less ego and be ready to just, give up the mantle and understand that the evolution that we're wanting and working toward, it's gonna be in the next generation now. So recognize that privilege of being able to step back.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of a good segue. So we're now hitting our Q&A session portion of the podcast. So for the audience that are watching us live, feel free to drop in questions in the chat. We already have one from an amazing Kyori the Copy, who's also a friend of us here. So shout out to Robbie. But also, just dropping in a little bit, follow Cody the Copy also. He's also an artist, so I just want to give him a shout out. But Casey mentioned Nikkei student unions, and I think we'll get a good mix of responses to this. So myself, Matt, and Casey were heavily involved in college. Specifically, I joke it's kind of true that my whole life in college kind of surrounded Nikkei Student Union, and from there kind of branched out the opportunities to be more involved with National JCL, Demands in Our Committee, those different organizations. So hitting into that question though, without Nikkei Student Union in college, I wouldn't have been involved in the JA community. How do y'all feel is a way to help with reaching out to other JAs that don't have easy access to community? And I think I will want to start off with Haruka because acknowledging that 3 of us have a West Coast bias, so maybe we have a little bit easier access to the Japanese communities, Japanese American communities, especially with the only remaining existing acknowledged Japantowns, right? In NorCal, we have SF, and in SoCal, we have Little Tokyo. So we have easy access to maybe physically going to those Japantowns. So for you, Haruka, being a recent undergraduate, now graduate student, but still a young adult, how are you reaching out, accessing the Japanese American community, or advice that you have navigating that space and trying to find those spaces?
Yeah, thank you so much, Lauren. I think the first time I heard about NSU was from Lauren, because I think it's not really East Coast thing, or at least NYU didn't have that. We did have a JC, no, that's like JC something. It's like Japanese American Club. And I actually didn't want to get involved because they had an interview and they were asking me, why do you want to be part of it? And I thought, well, because I'm Japanese, why would I not, So I actually didn't really like that process. I never got in. And so I never had the opportunity to be involved in a student level organization in my college and right now in master's. But what I found throughout my college is kind of external chosen family. And, Lauren noticed, but I've been an intern for US Japan Council for the past 3 years. And that, national level or multinational level nonprofit has allowed me to meet with local JAs in New York City. And I had no idea these people existed until I went to USJC, because a lot of the JA community-based organizations here are, yes, they're for Japanese Americans, but a lot of the people, or the people who sponsor these organizations, are Japanese expats. So they do lack that portion of Japanese American history, or what it means to be Japanese American living here, multi-generational. And then so I couldn't really get that kind of community just from me living here as a student, or me growing up in elementary and middle school. But USJC allowed me to meet these powerful individuals who are not only, in New York City, but have all these network across the US. And so I feel like, whenever I meet someone from Japan that comes to New York City for college, and they want to learn more about, Japanese American history, and they go to these organizations, I, kindly remind them that, that's not a representation of whole, JA experience. If you want to get to know the, Japanese Americans who have been here, pre, during, and post-war, and have been here longer than the expats, or even outside our communities, you do need to find these individuals who are here, and they are so willing to provide that time. So I think me extending myself outside of school allowed me to find that community. But also, again, New York City is also very diverse, so it's more maybe easier to access than maybe other states.
Yeah, and I think that's like Lauren said, we do have a lot of West Coast bias here. Although I will say I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, so that was a completely different experience. But really quick, I'll just say too, I think it's important to also note that you don't have to get involved in community at our age or even younger. Like some of us grew up in it, some of us have found it much, much later on. And I think the important thing is to just come and show up when you feel ready and when you find that community. Because I know there are some folks I've worked with. I have one friend who, well, they're my friend now, but they just messaged me out of the blue on LinkedIn. They're from Detroit. They were a daughter of an expat, and now they're very, very involved in the community and in JCL and are loving it. And I think that's one of those ways is just you find something that you can do, find something that you can join, find someone you can contact, and sort of find your way in that interests you, and that when you're ready and when it's your time. But I think moving on from that, when we get to some more questions before we wrap up in a few minutes, but I'll turn it over to Casey for this one because I think I want to hear Casey's perspective on this one. But a question from Ken Mochizuki. So, he asked, what would you want to say specifically to the Sansei generation? Which I think is always interesting for those of us who are Yon-Say, or in my case, Go-Say. So Casey, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And thanks, Ken, for this question. I think the first thing I want to say to the Sante generation is just thank you and express like deep and true gratitude for all that they poured into the community. I really feel that, like as cheesy as it is, like Santi generation walked so we could run. But like honestly, because like when I think of the Santi generation, I think of those that like came to the Japan towns and formed like the nonprofits and gave their time and their blood, sweat, and tears to being able to like form those communities and the temples and such, and really took up like the leadership, positions after the Nisei, could no longer hold those positions. And so I really value, all that Sensei have put into our community to make sure that it's here for, our generations. With that being said, and I think I touched on this earlier in the podcast too, I think, you know, I would like to say to the Sensei generation, you can trust us. Like you can rest now in a sense. Like even though I still very much want the Sensei generation to be involved, I think I would love to see more of a passing down of that knowledge now that, our generation is getting older and our generation is starting to seek out more opportunities in the JA community. And, kind of tying it to the last question of like how do we get people involved, or how do people find their way to the community. I think leadership positions are a very much a strong way of doing that, and they don't necessarily have to be like, oh, everyone's the executive director of their various nonprofits. Like you could be a leader in any form, in any space. And so I think to the Sansei generation, like just be able to recognize that, our generation is truly grateful, but that we're also in search and in need of those opportunities. And so, yeah, just have true trust in us.
I think too, like to give them like huge props and shout out to with both the Nisei and the Sansei, right? That they were helpful and they're the driving force of getting reparations, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, acknowledging that a lot of them were college students. So at one point their age, right? That were fighting um, for those rights and recognitions. So, like as Casey mentions, we give them huge props and thanks. I think too, um, I think it's gonna always be a continuous conversation and discussion. I think especially for some of us who actually have Sansei parents. So, I mean, I have Sansei parents. I think also just that respect goes both ways. I do respect you as my elder, as someone that has a lot of knowledge. Um, but I think too is please listen to us as well. To also respect where we're coming from and our experiences. Uh, I think that's a huge thing. I think that's something that I unfortunately see a lot of is with the separation is I feel like it's a lot of top down. And in this case, a lot of times Sansei is talking to the Yon-Say, and there's no opportunity for Yon-Say to also speak, to have a dialogue. So give us that opportunity to hear us out. Maybe, maybe something that we say, you'll be like, oh, hey, we already have tried that. But at least give us the opportunity to let us know what has and hasn't worked. Maybe we'll surprise you with coming up with something else. But I think, respect goes both ways. And to allow us that opportunity.
Yeah, and I just want to say, jumping off of that, like to the Sansei generation, I think they're in such a unique position where they have like the two of like they're sandwiched between two opposing forces where they're trying to honor like the Nisei generation and like hearing, their parents and like also coming from that experience, but then they're also having to be in conversation with us, the younger generation, who's like pushing and so I just want to recognize like that tension and that complicated situation that can be, and just again like say just admiration for all they've done.
Yeah. So moving on. So we talked about Sansei versus Yon-Say conversation. I think something that's quite something I've noticed is and wanting to bridge is kind of the Nikkei community as a whole. And so we talk about immigration generations, right? So the Sansei and the Yon-Say acknowledging most, but also not all, but most of us that were from the West Coast have Japanese American incarceration history. So the way our identity has shaped as being Nikkei, being Japanese American, has been uniquely different from those that we term as Shinnikkei, those that immigrated to the US after World War II. So they have more of the story of, right, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, or those kinds of conversations. But noticing that there is a separation in the dialogue and discussions that are had. So this question comes from another friend of ours, Hiro. Um, his question is, as a Shinnikkei, it took me a long time to get involved in the community. What do y'all think the community can do to welcome Shinnikkei into the JA community? So I will actually throw it to my co-host, Matt, to answer this question.
I will do my best, because obviously I'm not Shinnikkei, but I think it's a conversation that Lauren and I have had, as well as a lot of us in Nikkei Rising and JCL and a lot of Japanese American community spaces have had, is how do we not only bridge that separation between older and younger generations, but between generations that have immigrated at different times. And I think that too is going to be an ongoing conversation of how to best welcome Shinnikkei into Japanese American spaces and not, in some cases, not act as gatekeepers, because we've all experienced that in different ways, how we've felt like we haven't had access to things because there are those in power or who hold these positions that want to hold it from us, who don't feel we're ready or don't feel that we honor that story in one way or another. And whether that is the story of incarceration, of redress reparations, of just this entire 150-year plus history that we have as Japanese Americans, it can be really frustrating. And I think the main thing and the important thing is to just recognize that whether our family has ties to the incarceration, ties to the early immigrants in the 1800s, ties to redress and reparations, or just ties to being just Nikkei, just being Japanese because we have ancestry in Japan, I think that's the most important thing, is just recognizing that our community is so vastly different than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. It was so vastly different than it was during the incarceration era that we have all these stories, we have all these different experiences, and we have to understand that each one of those is going to coincide with each other. Each one is going to inform one another. The incarceration is going to inform what experiences and things that Shinnikke face today, just as much as um, Shinnikke experiences are going to affect Japanese Americans, because obviously we've seen this boom in Japanese pop culture in the United States. And I mean, things like anime and Pokemon and all these other things that some of us might have grown up loving still, but we don't have as much of a tie to as Shinnikke might. And I think that's the important thing to understand, is that, again, like Casey was saying, like Haruka was saying, it's bilateral. It goes both ways. It doesn't, one does not inform the other. They both inform each other. And I hope Hito would agree with that statement, and that other Shinnikke would also agree with that statement. Um, but I don't know if either Casey or Haruka, if you have anything final to add before I hand it back to Lauren.
I don't. I also want to say I'm not Shinnikke, so I don't want to speak for that community. But I think just in terms of like how we can, I really liked your sentiment about being open to dialogue in the same way that we're open to dialogue with different members of generation. Just constantly understanding that like our community is going to change and that it needs to evolve. And I think the whole world went through, in 2020, this kind of racial reckoning where we were beginning to understand and constantly question our meanings of identity and how we relate to each other and our world. And I think that was like the tipping point for a much larger discussion that needs to happen in our community about like what does the intersections of culture, community have to do, and how do we be welcoming to everyone.
Yeah. And I think I'll close out answering this question. The way that I always approach this conversation is I just need empathy and understanding. And as Matt said, especially understanding that things are connected with each other, allow me the time to explain that, because while you maybe have not personally experienced it yourself, or don't have that family history and understanding, it does impact you in some ways. It's an entirely different conversation we would have to talk about. We don't have the time to go into it, but just understanding that everything is interconnected, and that's what we want to have this conversation. And I also say, I don't need you to be just as passionate about it as me. I understand that like this is something that I love and I'm very passionate about talking about, something that interests me. And I understand that might not be the same for you, but to just hear me out and to at least care. I think what really frustrates me is the indifference that I might see from either side. And we can't have that, because I think we live in a world right now that's a little bit selfish. I think everything is connected with each other, and that we should be looking out for each other in whatever way. And that involves hearing each other's story and listening. Um, so I'm going to wrap this up with one final questions for our guests. We talked a lot about our involvement within the Japanese American community, advice for older generation, our generation. With that being said, what do you imagine, the future of the Japanese American community looking like to you? And any parting words or advice, last minute things that you want to say. So I will first have Haruka answer this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lauren. Yeah, I think it was so fascinating for me to kind of go through these questions and now kind of landing on this last one. Again, like I'm coming from this expats communities, and I feel like the future JA community will include them as part of them. And I think it's not that JA communities are not open. I went to JCL this summer and I felt like everyone was so welcoming and I felt such a family energy. And I was a little bit nervous about going in because it's like, oh, I'm not, American. I don't have the similar background, but everyone really valued me as much as other people would have. And so for me, I think what I see, which is an issue, is that a lot of the Japanese from Japan still have this stigma around Japanese Americans in the US. And that's something I still see to this day, and it's lessened over the generation. But one quick example is when I got into college in the US, some of my mother's friends asked my mom if I'm going to college in America because I couldn't get into University of Tokyo. And it's this idea of Japan's better than America, or people who went to America, they went there because they couldn't fit into Japanese, the superior country. And I think that's the notion that was there in an older generation. And yes, it is slowly disappearing, but yet it's still there. And so I think that, by having the conversation, having this open dialogue like this podcast, will probably going to lessen that over time. So I think that is my hope and the vision for our community in the future.
I think
Yeah,
that's
and I think,
Oh, sorry.
oh,
I was gonna pass it off to you, Casey, but I was gonna say, yeah, I think the understanding of what it means to be Nikkei, uh, Haruka, Matt, and I've had this conversation quite often of the definition of Nikkei, and I think it's for us, our understanding is anyone that is of Japanese heritage that's living outside of Japan. And that's why I think for us, we're understanding and more open and welcoming because we've always navigated feeling like we're between worlds. But also recognizing it's going to take time. It's not our decision to force you to agree with us. It's up to you and how you want to come to terms. And I think, as you mentioned, it's important to have these discussions. So apologies for interrupting, but Casey, what are your hopes and dreams? How do you see the future? Any parting words?
yeah, I guess to put it simply, like my hopes and dreams for the J community are that we keep having hopes and dreams, because I think that is truly how our communities push forward, is like we continue to want better for our community, we continue to want to see it thrive. I was feel that I was very lucky to grow up in the J community, and I grew up in primarily Buddhist spaces, and now my involvement in the community takes place in Japantown. And I think in my experience in those two spaces is that there can sometimes be this sentiment of um, that we're dying out, or that our community is, membership declining, or that our temples are dying, or things like that that make me think in a very like deficit mindset. However, I think that it's important to continue like recognizing that we are here, we are thriving. This podcast and Nikkei Rising and these spaces, they give me hope. And I think that's all to say that we need to just continue wishing better for our community and continue wanting to see it grow. I think in that growing is like something that we've brought up throughout this podcast is the ever diversifying aspect of our community. And so while we are having conversations about Shin Nikkei, we also need to be having conversations about mixed race Nikkei, queer Nikkei, adopted Nikkei, Nikkei that, hold many intersections of identities that, really need to be welcomed with whole hearts. And so, yeah, again, thank you so much, Lauren, Matt, and Nikkei Rising for having me. This has been amazing.
Yeah, and we're so fortunate to have both of you. I'm so happy that we were able to highlight you as young adults activists and leaders in our JA community. And I'm so proud to have you all as friends. So we're so thankful for you to be here today to share your wisdom. So that kind of wraps it up for us. You know, thank you everyone for joining us today for a special live episode for Tadaima 2023. There was something that was put into the chat of how can you get involved with Nikkei Rising, right? So anyone is welcome to join as a Nikkei Rising member, or if you're interested in being more involved, like myself and Matt as Nikkei Rising coordinators, pushing out the social media content or creating podcast episodes like the one you're listening to right now, feel free to reach out and follow us on social media platforms at Nikkei Rising. We have a lot of things coming up that we're really excited to announce and to share with all of y'all. So please make sure to be following those platforms. So yeah, that wraps it up. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening, this morning, wherever you are tuning in from. Have a wonderful rest of your evening or day.